Good morning, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to visit Durango, and it's a pleasure to address you. And I'm also very grateful for Dr. Pachauri. I have been his friend for the past decades, and that's also one of the reasons why I'm present here today. So I think that he was a great communicator of climate science, and because of him, these. So I'm very grateful for Dr. Pachauri, because he was the one who was able to communicate the climate science message to many of the decision makers and heads of state who have been present here today. And I'm very much missing him as my very good friend for the past decades, and I had a chance to talk to him still a few weeks ago, and then he was still planning to come here, but I hope that his spirit is flying around here. Next, please. So my own background is in science, and I have been Secretary General of the WMO for the past 4 years, and I have been also dealing with IPCC as a scientist, and I have also been dealing with energy sector, and I will show you some perspectives from that side as well. Next, please. So I'm leading World Meteorological Organization, which is the UN specialized agency on weather, climate, and water, and we are the founding father of IPCC, and we are also hosting IPCC today. And our members are very much contributing to the science, and we are forming the basis of observations, and when it comes to climate parameters, and when it comes to greenhouse gases, for example. And I will soon show you some results. We will publish a new State of Climate report in New York together with Antonio Guterres the coming Tuesday, and I will show you some slides. So don't tell anybody that I have shown these slides already for you before it's going to be released in New York. And we have observing systems, satellites, ground-based measurements, balloons, and so forth, and that's the basis of the things that I will soon show to you. Next, please. So we have World Economic Forum, which is meeting every January in Davos, and where the world leaders and world economic leaders come together, and every year they are estimating what are the biggest risks for the global economy, and what is the likelihood of certain things to happen. And you can see that climate failure in climate mitigation, natural disasters, problems related to water resources, they are very high on the agenda. When they had their meeting in January, they didn't know that we are going to have this coronavirus, and the likelihood of that wasn't very high, but now we have also that kind of impact on global economy. Next, please. And we have seen a growing amount of disasters. This is statistics of major natural disasters, and we have seen especially a major increase in the amount of storms and flooding events, and some increase in the amount of heat waves and drought events. Next, please. And this is the temperature graph since 1850. Last year was the second warmest year. So far the warmest year has been 2016, which was boosted by very strong El Nino. And last January was the warmest January ever, and last winter was the warmest winter in Europe ever. So the climate change is also very visible when it comes to temperature records. Next, please. And more and more of the global population, they are exposed to heat waves, and last year we had 220 million people who were exposed to heat waves, and we have been also seeing growing amount of casualties related to heat waves. That's a consequence of warming temperatures, and this trend is supposed to continue for the coming decades anyhow. Next, please. And of course you all know that we have seen major warming taking place in the Arctic, where we have melted large amounts of snow and ice, and also in the Mediterranean region in summertime we have seen much higher changes in temperatures than the global average. Next, please. And in case of greenhouse gases, as the previous speaker was just mentioning, we are breaking records, and year by year the carbon dioxide records are broken, and the same is true for methane and nitrous oxide. And out of those, of course, carbon dioxide is the most important one. It has contributed 2/3 of the warming so far, and its lifetime is up to several hundreds of years. So this problem doesn't go away, although we would stop the emissions today. The nice thing with methane is that its lifetime is only 11 years, and has contributed 17% of the warming so far. Next, please. And we have stored more than 90% of the extra heat that we have produced to the system, to the oceans, and they have been warming by 0.5 degree so far, and that's contributing to the tropical storms. We have wider areas where we can see tropical storms nowadays. For example, last April there was a devastating cyclone hitting Mozambique, and that's a consequence of warming of the oceans. Next, please. And sea level rise has been 26 centimeters so far, and the most recent estimates of by the end of this century, they are now higher than they used to be at the last IPCC report 4 years ago, and that's because we have seen boost in the melting of Greenland and more recently also Antarctic glacier, and that's why the upper estimates are fairly high nowadays. This is also fairly uncertain, so we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but the overall message is that the numbers are higher now. Next, please. And then we have been melting mountain glaciers, and there has been a boost in this melting during the past 20 years. And these glaciers are very important as a source of fresh water for the main rivers in China, India, Latin America, North America, and also in Europe. So that's again one sign of climate change. Next, please. And actually, the major impacts of climate change have been felt through changes in the precipitation patterns, and this is long-term statistics of rainfall amounts, and these brownish areas indicate the decrease in rainfall amounts, and we have seen that happening especially in Africa, in southern parts of Asia, and also in some parts of South America. Next, please. And last year we had drought problems hitting also Mexico and Caribbean area, and also in South America and Canada, and we were having record drought in Australia, which led to forest fires, and the emissions coming from those fires, they have been exceeding the annual emissions of Australia. And same happened in Russia last year. We had severe forest fires in Siberia, and again they were exceeding the annual emissions of the country. And 2 years ago it happened also in Canada, and again they were exceeding the Canadian annual carbon dioxide emissions. So forest fires are also a big issue nowadays. Next, please. IMF has estimated what has been the impact of the current warming to global economy, and this graph shows that the southern hemisphere and low latitudes of northern hemisphere have already suffered economically because of climate change, and only the high northern latitudes have benefited because of better growing season and less demand of heating energy, for example. Next, please. And at the moment we are moving towards 3 degrees or warmer temperatures the pledges behind Paris Agreement haven't been followed by the countries, and this is demonstrating what would happen to the global food production capacity if we would reach 3 degrees. And these red colors indicate the decrease of crop yields, and you can see that large parts of the world is red. It's in North and South America, it's very much in Africa, Southern Asia, and so forth. And only few areas would benefit, and these green areas, they are not the most suitable areas for agriculture. So food crisis is one of the concerns related to climate change. Next, please. And the previous speaker was talking about population growth. That's also an issue that we should talk about. And if you have connections to Pope, or if you have connections to the Islamic leaders, that's also an important issue to be considered. And this is demonstrating where we expect to see water challenges and population growth challenges already during the coming decades. And you can see that Africa and southern part of Asia are the most vulnerable areas in that respect. Next, please. And finally, I would like to say a few words about emissions, and we have been breaking emission records year by year, and this is very much related to the growth of energy demand, and this energy demand has been very much comforted by using fossil sources of energy, especially gas and also coal, unfortunately. And China is #1, and classically Europe and USA have been the key players, and now you can see that there's also major growth of the emissions in non-OECD countries, which is demonstrating that if we want to solve this problem, we have to have global agreements. USA nor Europe cannot solve it alone, and China cannot solve it alone, but we need everybody on board. Next, please. And IPCC produced its 1.5 degree report 1.5 years ago, and there they estimated whether it's technically or economically feasible to target this 1.5 degrees, which is very ambitious target. And to reach that, we should bend this emission growth curve in 5 years and become carbon neutral by 2050. And European countries are at the moment having such a target. And if we would like to reach the upper limit of Paris Agreement, we have 15 years time to bend the curve, and we should be carbon neutral by 2070. And if we don't do anything, we would reach 3 to 5 degrees by the end of this century, and 8 degrees by the end of next century. Next, please. This is my final slide demonstrating what is the climate mitigation challenge. Here it's shown that 85% of the global energy is produced based on oil, gas, and coal, and only 15% is based on nuclear, hydro, and renewables. And to be successful in the mitigation, we should revert those numbers in the coming decades. And we have technical means for that. And we have also economic means for that, both in transport sector, in energy sector, and also in industry. And also we as consumers, we have a role to play here. Next, please. And finally, I would like to demonstrate that this coronavirus issue has also had an impact on emissions, and this is a graph showing what has happened to the nitrous oxide emissions in China. This is the average of NO2 in January, and end of January case, there's been a dramatic drop of the emissions because of this coronavirus outbreak. So if there are any good news related to that, that graph is showing that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for to the organizers for inviting me. It's a particular honor to be here today at this special occasion. And it's actually also quite a challenge to stand here today at a time when I would say the world has lost one of its most visionary thinkers, with Dr. Pachauri. I mean, I have been working with Dr. Pachauri, or Pachi, as I know him, in the IPCC for roughly 15 years, both in the fourth and as well as in the fifth assessment report, and have seen how he basically has moved the IPCC and has organized the IPCC towards the Nobel Peace Prize. And I think another really milestone achievement from him was the establishment of Petteri, which is the world leading think tank in energy in India. So I have known him also as a passionate fighter for climate change, and the main weapon that he usually had with him was science. So science and information to combat climate change. And I will also give a scientific presentation in that sense. And I want to start to talk about the so-called, next please. And I want to talk about the so-called carbon budget and tell you a little bit about how much time is left, or how much emissions can we still emit into the atmosphere. So if we want to stop global warming, it is necessary to bring down emissions to zero. And the lower you want to, the less climate change you want to have, the earlier you need to reduce emissions to zero. Historically, we have emitted roughly 2,200 gigatons of CO2 already into the atmosphere. And it is expected that we'll have some non-CO2 emissions into the future. Next, please. Which gives us a remaining carbon budget of how much we actually can still emit into the atmosphere before emissions need to go down to zero. Next, please. And this amount is 420 gigatons if we want to achieve 1.5 degrees with a high likelihood. This means basically that we have already emitted 2,200 and only 400 is left. So 4/5 of all the emissions that we can emit into the atmosphere have already been emitted. And the other important factor here is that we need to understand that every year we are emitting at the moment 42 gigatons. If the budget is 420 and we are emitting 42 gigatons, there is 10 years left by which we will achieve the 1.5 degree climate change, which is the objective of the Paris Agreement. These numbers are uncertain, and the uncertainties are also shown here. So we are talking about something like plus minus 400 gigatons as an uncertainty here, which translates into plus minus 10 years more or less. So there is really very little time left to reduce emissions to zero so that we basically can stay within the temperature limit of 1.5 degrees, which is the objective of the Paris Agreement. Next, please. Why 1.5 degrees and not 2 degrees or not 3 degrees? I think we have already shown, Professor Taalas has shown a number of different impacts that are happening when climate changes. I'm showing here the picture of 3 degrees. The people exposed to multisectoral extremes at 3 degrees, and the darker the color gets, the more people are exposed in the future to extremes if temperature changes to roughly 3 degrees. Next, please. Next, please. Now you can see how the map changes. Basically, if you reduce the temperature to 2 degrees. Next, please. And how this map actually changes if you go down to 1.5 degrees. The important message of this figure is that if you reduce temperatures, the temperature change to 1.5 degrees, you reduce the impact significantly. But there are many spots still in this graph. So there are many areas in the world where even at 1.5 degrees, we can expect major hotspots in this case in terms of multi-sectoral impacts on land, water, as well as on energy systems. Next, please. And I would say even more important than the figure itself is that we expect in the future that impacts are also occurring there where the poorest of the poor live. And this is particularly important because the poor people don't have the capacity to adapt. Climate change is happening without the possibility to react to this, which amplifies the impacts. And the difference, for example, between 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees means halving the people who are living in extreme poverty in terms of exposure to multi-sectoral extremes. So we're talking about the benefits of 100 millions of people if we manage not to limit temperature change at 2 degrees, but at 1.5 degrees. Next slide, please. So the next question that I wanted to address is, what are we doing enough at the moment? Is the Paris Agreement and the process that we have after Paris Agreement, is that sufficient in order to achieve 1.5 degrees? And in this figure, you can see basically emissions in the past from 1950 to something like 2020 today, and then model projections into the future, the red ones, which are projections based on what countries have pledged at the moment in order to reduce emissions consistent with the Paris Agreement, or following the Paris Agreement, not consistent with the Paris Agreement. As you can see, emissions of the so-called NDCs are continuing to increase, and this is inconsistent with the emissions pathways which are calculated by different models in order to stay at within 2 degrees or within 1.5 degrees. So if you look at that, you can see very clearly that there is a very big gap between the global ambition of different countries today and where we need to be for staying or limiting climate change to 1.5 or 2 degrees. Next, please. And I would say a very important implication from this slide is that in 1.5 degree scenarios, we need to achieve net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. So we need to have a very rapid decline phase, and in the long term, we might be even in need to create negative emissions from man-made activities. Next slide, please. So we need a very rapid and also changes which are unprecedented. And there's a portfolio of different measures that we need to take. So we need to reduce emissions across all different sectors. The scientific studies show us that there are a range of different technologies available, but at the same time, technological solutions might not be enough. In some cases, it is necessary to change also behaviors, perhaps even to change lifestyles. And at the same time, we need to massively increase investments into carbon neutral options and technologies. Next, please. And the 4 main building blocks or elements of the transition are measures that help us to increase the efficiency of the energy system. So we need to try that by 2050, we don't have higher energy demand than today. We can have more services, but we should use for those services less energy. So we need to increase the productivity of the energy system. Efficiency is an extremely important measure. At the same time, we need to reduce the CO2 emissions from the power sector. So usually in all of these scientific studies, the power sector is decarbonizing first because it has a limited number of actors. It's a very centralized sector. The alternatives are known and are on the market. And that's why in the future projections, electricity decarbonizes first. And then at the same time as we decarbonize basically the supply side, we need to bring electricity to the demand. So we switch basically from using a diesel for heating or diesel for cars. At the end use side, we will switch to more electricity. So we electrify demand, and we decarbonize the electricity supply. Next slide, please. Those big changes, of course, have implications for other societal objectives than climate change. And the other big international agreement which is on the table are the Sustainable Development Goals. And you can see here different squares showing the different development goals. And I think it is really critically important that we introduce climate change that help us to create synergies with those other objectives like minimizing, reducing hunger, improving health, sustainable water use, sustainable water land management. Next, please. Next. And there's a big challenge to look at those interactions between climate and energy transformation and the Sustainable Development Goals. And the main challenge is that many of those goals, let's say poverty, equity, land, are very local, but climate policy needs to happen coordinated at the global scale. Next slide, please. And the scientific community has a number of different coordinated efforts to try to understand what are the implications of very stringent climate policies for the SDGs. And this is a summary graph here that I'm showing. Basically, I'm showing the impact of 1.5-degree policies. If the bars go down, you see a synergy, a co-benefit. Basically, if you push climate policy, you get also benefits for the SDGs. But there are also areas on the left-hand side where you can see quite some possible negative effects as well. Next slide, please. So at the one hand, you have mitigation co-benefits, but on the other hand, you have also mitigation risks. Next slide, please. And the trick is to design climate policies that can eradicate the risks while maximizing the synergies. So a carbon price alone as a policy will not be sufficient. I need to introduce a carbon price, but at the same time make sure that that carbon price doesn't make energy unaffordable for the poorest in the world. Next slide, please. And this is my final slide. Yeah, next slide, please. So my final slide, when it comes, tries to show you that scientific studies, yeah, please go to the next slide. And next. Too many animations, sorry for that. Okay, this slide shows you very clearly that those negative effects and trade-offs in principle can be avoided. So that there is a risk that climate policy might create trade-offs for development, poverty, and energy access. But the scientific studies show you that basically with relatively low costs, you can significantly eradicate or reduce those trade-offs if policy design is beyond just introducing carbon prices. So thank you very much. Thank you.
I'm very grateful for this opportunity to send you a recorded video in which I want to convey a few things that essentially are at the very core of reducing risk and increasing resilience in our societies, in our various geographical locations. But as the old Sanskrit saying, Vasudeva Kutumbakam, tells us, the universe is one family. When I had the privilege of receiving the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the IPCC, I used this term in my acceptance address. And there, I wanted to emphasize the fact that even though we may be in a remote corner of the globe, we have to be concerned about what the impacts of climate change would be in faraway places on the same globe. We are all residents of the same planet. Finally, we have the means to limit climate change and to help build a more sustainable and cleaner future for all living species. Let me show you a diagram that records the changes in temperature that have taken place since the middle of the 19th century. And you would observe that there are fluctuations in temperature. Why? Well, simply because these temperature fluctuations are the result of both natural as well as human-induced changes that are taking place in the climate. But what is particularly significant, if you observe, is the fact that since the middle of the last century, there has been a rapid increase. Why do we have this increase from the middle of the last century? Well, essentially because the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which includes carbon dioxide and a few other gases, has increased so rapidly that clearly it is affecting the climate, and most of the warming that has taken place since the middle of the last century is extremely likely the result of human actions. And when we use the term extremely likely, we are assigning a probability of over 95%. As a result of warming that has been taking place on the surface of land as well as the oceans, we find that the bodies of ice across the globe have been melting. And actually they've been melting at an increasing rate in recent years. At the same time, with the warming of the oceans, thermal expansion is causing an increase in sea level rise, which adds to the water that is produced as a result of bodies of ice on the surface of land. As a result of both these factors, we've had sea level rise, which, as you would observe in this second diagram, has been a total of 19 centimeters on average across the globe. Of course, it varies from place to place, but the average of 19 centimeters is very close to a foot. So you can imagine those people who are living close to low-lying coastal areas, those who are living in the small island states, some of which are hardly a meter above sea level, that means about a yard or so above sea level, would clearly be affected by this kind of sea level rise which has taken place over the last century and up to the year 2010. So this is something that we have to take very seriously, because sea level rise will continue if we don't bring about massive mitigation of greenhouse gases, if we don't reduce the emissions of these greenhouse gases. And do you want to know what it would be if we didn't take any action? Well, by the middle of this century, we could get sea level rise of 98 centimeters, which is close to a meter, certainly more than a yard. Just imagine what happens to people living in the Maldives Islands. This is a nation of over 1,000 islands, very small, just about a yard or so above water. And if we get sea level rise at the level that I've just mentioned to you, clearly this would threaten the very existence of people and other species living on these islands. Where do these emissions come from? Well, 35% come from the supply of energy. 24% come from agriculture, forestry and land use. 21% comes from industry. 14% of the emissions come from transport and 6.4% from buildings. So clearly the priorities before us are very clear. We have to bring about a change in the way we supply energy so that emissions over there are reduced. But also important is the agriculture, forestry and land use sector. Of course, industry, buildings, transport, all of these are important. Why do we need to worry about climate change? Of course, climate change is not merely a smooth, steady, linear increase in temperature. It has all kinds of impacts that are now becoming increasingly serious. What are these impacts? Firstly, there's been an increase in extreme weather and climate events. And the two types of events that I want to place before you for your attention are extreme precipitation events. That means heavy rainfall in a short period of time, and that can create risks. It can create mudslides, it can create floods, it can damage property, it can certainly threaten lives. The other type of extreme event that we need to worry about are heat waves. And I want to tell you that if we don't take action on a timely basis, then those heat waves which currently occur once in 20 years could by the end of the century occur once in 2 years. And that's going to be very, very difficult to manage. I just want to tell you what the effect of a heat wave can be. In the year 2003, there was a massive heat wave in Europe and over 40,000 people died. These are essentially people who are old, the elderly, very young children who just cannot adapt to the extreme increase in temperature, and therefore there is morbidity. That means people getting sick, and there are also deaths. So we need to be concerned about that. On this slide you also see some other impacts that are listed, but I don't want to go into each one of these. The basic fact is that the impacts of climate change are going to be felt on human health. Certainly sea level rise is a serious problem on the availability of water. There would be impacts on agriculture. So what can we do? Firstly, we will have to adapt to the impacts of climate change, because climate change will continue for several decades even if we bring down emissions of greenhouse gases to zero. Why? Because there's a certain inertia in the system. Because of the high concentration of greenhouse gases in the past, climate change is going to continue for a while. So we have to adapt to that. How do we adapt? Well, we have to manage our water better. Those areas which are close to the sea, we'll have to make sure that we don't construct buildings that might be vulnerable, that might be exposed to danger from sea level rise, and so on. But we also know that beyond a certain point, we would not be able to adapt to the impacts of climate change, because those impacts will become so serious that human capacity and human capability will not be able to deal with them. So what do we do to make sure that climate change does not lead to worse impacts over a period of time? Well, we really don't have a choice. First, we have to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and bring about major improvements in the efficiency of energy use, whether it's in the transport sector. That means using more public transport, more use of bicycles, perhaps walking where it's possible, and so on. We also have to make sure that we move to those sources of energy which have a low carbon content, and that would be possibly nuclear if some country wants it. It could be large scale use of renewable energy, and we could also develop technologies by which we can carry out carbon capture and storage. So really speaking, we have to move to a distinctly different energy future for human society. One important point that I'd like to make is that these technologies are available with us today. We can make a major start of this journey, and I think this has to be in the hands of the youth of the world.
As Gandhiji rightly said, be the change you want to see in the world. So under the POP movement, we're trying to motivate youth to reduce their carbon footprints, because they must bring about behavioral and lifestyle changes by which they reduce their carbon footprints as rapidly as possible.
Gracias por permitirnos estar aquí. Mi co-chair
Thank
tiene un
you
poco de
for allowing
poco
us
tiempo
to be
porque debe
here.
ir al aeropuerto, pero
I want to
entendemos su
welcome
posición.
all the members
Quiero dar la
of
bienvenida
the
a todos los
panel,
miembros del panel
and
y
for the sake of
decir que
time,
en aras del
we
tiempo
try
vamos a
to
tratar
fulfill
de ser
the schedule.
cumplidos con lo que
Each
estaba
person
previsto.
has
Cada
4
persona
minutes
tiene
to
4
speak
minutos para hablar y
and
para
give
decir
their
su
opinion
opinión
on
respecto
how
del tema
climate
de
change
cómo afecta
affects
el
the
cambio climático,
1.5
ese
degrees Celsius
1.5 grados
rise
al
in the
futuro
future,
y
and
cuáles
what
son
are
las
the expectations
expectativas que
we have
tenemos
to
para
change. I
cambiar.
dare
Me
to make
atrevo a hacer
a
una
first comment
primera
since I
insinuación,
come from the
ya
field
que
of
provengo desde el
education. I
ámbito de la
think that
educación.
education is a
Creo que
very
educación
important
es una
word
palabra
when
muy
we talk
importante cuando
about
hablamos de
how to
cómo
mitigate, how to
mitigar,
change the
cómo
parameters that
cambiar
we
los
have in the
parámetros que
current
tenemos
moments.
en
It
los
also
actuales
seems to
momentos.
me that we
Me
have to
parece también
touch
que
on the
tenemos que tocar el
subject
tema de
of
la
science,
ciencia, porque la ciencia
because
nos puede dar muchas
science can
respuestas
give us
y
many
también
answers
apelar
and
a
also
los
appeal
gobiernos
to local
locales. Me da
governments.
pena
I am
decirlo, pero
sorry to
los
say,
gobiernos
but
nacionales
national
no están
governments
haciendo bien
are
su
not
trabajo.
doing
Nos lo
their
están
job well. They
demostrando
are
el
showing
poco
it
respeto que tienen
because
por el
of a
Pacto de
little
París
respect
y
they
lo que ha
have
ocurrido
for
en
the
las siguientes
agreement of
reuniones
Paris and what
mundiales,
has
las
happened
COP
in the
y
world
otras sobre
meetings
cambio
like
climático.
the
Qué
COPs and
importante es
other
empezar
meetings
a mirar a
on
los
climate
gobiernos
change.
locales
How
que pueden
important
hacer
is it to
aquellos
start
cambios dentro de
looking
sus
at local
circunscripciones
governments
territoriales.
that
can
más, con esto
make those
voy a pasar a
changes
mi
within
co-chair,
their territorial
quien está
constituency.
en
Without further
representación
ado, I
de
give
la
the floor
Universidad
to the co-president who
Autónoma
is representing
Metropolitana y
the
quien viene
Rector
en
General
representación
of
del
the Autonomous
Rector.
Metropolitan
Sylvie va a
University.
dirigir unas
Sylvie
palabras
will
para luego
give a few
pasarla a
words
cada uno de
and
nuestros
then each
panelistas.
of the panelists.
Muchas gracias.
Good
Buenas tardes a
afternoon,
todos.
everyone.
Me da mucho
I am
gusto
very
estar aquí.
pleased to be here.
Estuve también en
I
el primer
attended
evento que se
in
celebró en la Ciudad de México
2018
y
the
espero
first
que este
forum
segundo evento
that
tendrá
was
los
held
mismos avances
in
que el primero.
Mexico
Me
City,
uno también a las penas
and I hope
por la
that this forum
ejecución hace
has
poquito
the
del
same
doctor
progress
Pachauri. Yo también estoy
at
muy triste por esta
has
noticia.
the same
El doctor
progress
Fernández me la
as
anunció
the
ayer
first.
y sí, me puse muy
My
triste
deep
con todo el mundo.
regret for
Pues yo
Dr.
vengo de
Pachauri's death.
una universidad que
I feel
está
equally
principalmente
sad
en la Ciudad de México
for
y
the
también acá
news that was
estudiantes
communicated
muy
to me
preocupados
yesterday
por la cuestión del
by
cambio
Dr.
climático,
Adrián
donde es muy complicado
Fernández.
también
My
ya
university,
enseñar.
that is
Es una
mainly in
raro
Mexico
todavía
City,
para muchos.
has many
Parece
students
raro, pero
very
así es.
concerned
Entonces, yo espero
about
que
climate
lo que
change.
podremos
I hope that what we can learn in this event will help to continue in this direction. I give the floor to Dr. Ana Cecilia Conde. Good
Bueno,
morning.
¿me
For the
escuchan?
panel, they sent us
espero que sí,
some
porque no traigo
questions
lentes.
that
Entonces no veo
I
si me
will
dice que sí o que
gladly
no. No
share
escuchan.
with the organizers
¿Así?
that are
¿Así
in
sí?
English.
Ah,
But
bueno,
my
entonces me lo
talk
pego.
will be in Spanish. I will
Para el
mention
panel
some
nos
points.
mandaron
The
unas
first
preguntas
question
que
is, if we
con
exceed
gusto voy a
1.5
compartir con
degrees
los
Celsius,
organizadores.
what
Las
would be
contesté en
the
inglés,
adaptation
pero
actions
aprovechando
and
que la
risk
mayoría
responses? My
aquí habla
first
español,
observation is that
voy a
all
decir
the
algunos
current
puntos
models
rápidos.
and their
La primera
comparison
pregunta
tell
es,
us that
si
we
repasamos
have
el
to hurry up
1.5, ¿qué
because
acciones de
the
adaptación
atmosphere
y
reacts
respuestas al riesgo?
faster and actually
Mi primera
heats
observación
up
es que
faster.
todos
This
los
is
modelos
called a sense
actuales,
of urgency.
la
The
intercomparación
second
de modelos
is that
dicen que
adaptation
tenemos
actions are
que
a
apurar el
global
paso
objective, and
porque la
therefore we
atmósfera en
need
realidad
metrics,
reacciona
which
más
is
rápido y
called
se
monitoring,
calienta más rápido.
evaluation,
Eso se
and
llama
learning.
sentido de
And what
urgencia.
do we
La
have to
segunda
measure
es
to
que
know
las
if
acciones de
we
adaptación son
are
un
on the
objetivo
path to
global
adaptation?
y
We
por
have to
tanto
measure
necesitamos
changes. We
métricas,
have to
lo que se llama
change, and we
monitoreo,
have to
evaluación
change
y
practices,
aprendizaje. ¿Y qué
processes,
es lo que
and
tenemos que
structures.
medir
And
para
it
saber
is
si
at the
estamos en el
last
camino de la
point where
adaptación?
governments
Tenemos
have
que
to participate.
medir cambios,
Structures
hay que
have
cambiar
to change,
y hay que cambiar
particularly
prácticas,
formal
procesos
institutions.
y
And
estructuras.
a very
Y es el
important
último
point
punto
that
en donde
has
los gobiernos
emerged
tienen
in
que entrar, se
climate
tienen que
justice.
cambiar las
Climate
estructuras,
change is not only
particularmente
an
las
environmental
instituciones
emergency
formales.
problem, but
Y un
also an ethical
punto
and
muy
political one.
importante que ha
How do
surgido
we
es
do
justicia
science?
climática.
How
Cambio
science can be
climático no es solo
politically
un
relevant,
problema
and
de
how
emergencia
politicians
ambiental,
must
sino
make
es un problema
decisions based
ético
on
y
good
político.
science.
Es
This
cómo hacemos
is
ciencia,
basic to advance
cómo la
adaptation. I
ciencia
also
puede
believe that
ser
national
políticamente
science
relevante
must be
y cómo
developed
los
in the
políticos
case
tienen que
of the
tomar
impact
decisiones
1.5
fundamentados
degrees
en una buena
Celsius of
ciencia.
temperature
Y eso
increase.
es,
Studies are
creo
being
que es
carried out. A
fundamental para
very
avanzar en la
important
adaptación.
study
Me chiflan
is
cuando
what
ya
will
estoy muy
happen
cerca.
to the soils of
También creo que hay que
Mexico if the global
desarrollar
temperature
ciencia nacional.
increases
Para el
in that
caso del
1.5
impacto de
degrees Celsius.
1.5,
A study
del
developed
aumento
by
de temperatura
Dr. Jesús
1.5 global, se están
Gómez
haciendo
from
estudios.
Durango
Un
has
estudio
from
muy importante es
Durango,
qué le va a
his
pasar a los
results
suelos de
indicate that
México
we are going to
si
have
aumentara la
an
temperatura global
important moisture
1.5. Ese
deficit
estudio lo
in
hizo
the
el doctor
soil. We
Jesús David
have
Gómez,
also
que es
studies of middle
paisano de
cities
aquí de
and
Durango.
what
No sé
would
dónde nació,
happen
pero Durango
with
sí.
1.5 degrees
Y lo pueden
Celsius.
buscar.
Finally,
Es
for
muy
regional
importante
studies
porque
and
sus
loss of
resultados indican que
biodiversity,
vamos a
such
tener
as
déficit de humedad en los
coral
suelos
reefs
muy
and
importante.
others,
También
there
se han hecho
is a
estudios de
very
ciudades
interesting
medias y qué
study
pasaría con
by
1.5.
Dr. Miguel León Portilla
Finalmente,
and
para la parte
Dr.
de pérdida,
José
estudios
Sarucán,
regionales y
a
pérdida
book,
de
Pensar la
biodiversidad,
vida,
como
which
arrecifes
says that
coralinos y demás.
Mexico
Hay
is
un estudio muy
culturally and
interesante del doctor
biologically
Miguel
mega
León Portilla
diverse.
que
They
recién
are two
murió,
very
y el doctor José
important
Soruplan, que lo
riches,
van a ver
and
mañana, que se
preserving
llama el
them
libro
is
Pensar la
fundamental.
vida,
I think we
y
have
que dice que
global
México es
actors and
cultural
also
y
in Mexico
biológicamente megadiverso.
fundamental
Son dos
actors
riquezas muy
such
importantes
as
y
young
conservar esas
people.
dos
The Paris
riquezas
Agreement
es
says
fundamental.
that we have to
Creo que
fight
tenemos a
for
nivel global, pero también en
intergenerational
el país,
equity
actores
and
fundamentales
also
como son los
gender
jóvenes.
issues
En el acuerdo
like
de París
women
dice tenemos
and
que
a
luchar
women's
por una
movement in
equidad
Mexico City.
intergeneracional.
Nadie
También
se
el
mueve.
asunto de género, ya
They
saben, el
are
9 nadie se
emerging
mueve.
actresses that
Son
must
actrices
be
emergentes que
incorporated.
hay que incorporar y
Mexico
que no tienen que
also
estar en
has
una estructura
indigenous knowledge
gubernamental. Y por
organized
supuesto,
facing
México también cuenta
environmental
con
problems and climate
conocimiento
change.
indígena y local
Some
que
important
se ha
lines
organizado y que
for
está
people
enfrentando
who
los problemas
protect
ambientales y de
biodiversity
cambio
and
climático.
forests
Y algunas
say
líneas
the
importantes
land
para la
rights
gente
of
que protege
indigenous
biodiversidad y
peoples
bosques
and
dice hay
communities
que asegurar los
must
derechos
be
de la tierra
ensured.
de los pueblos
We
y
need to
comunidades
protect
indígenas,
the
hay que
forests
fortalecer la
and
protección
the
de los
integrity
bosques
of
y la integridad de los
ecosystems.
ecosistemas,
We
hay que
must
restaurar
restore
los
degraded
bosques
forests and
degradados y los
ecosystems.
ecosistemas, y hay que
And
impulsar la agroecología
we
y la
must
soberanía
promote
alimentaria.
agroecology and
Estos son
food
estudios
sovereignty.
de una organización que se llama
These are
Clara, así
studies
como
of
la de
an
huevo, pero
organization
quiere decir
called
Land Assessment, no sé qué,
Clara. The
búsquenlo
study
y
gives
van a ver
numbers
las
of
contabilidades que
how
hacen
much
de cada
carbon
una de estas
dioxide
medidas, cuánto
can be
dióxido de carbono
sequestered
puede
if
secuestrarse
we
si
keep these
conservamos estas
conditions.
condiciones.
Thank you.
Bueno, doctora Margarita García Gasca, de la Universidad de Querétaro. Muchas gracias,
Thank
muy
you
buenas
very
tardes a
much,
todos y a
and
todas.
thank you
Primero
very
saludar y me
much,
da
and good
de verdad
afternoon,
mucho gusto estar
everyone. I am
aquí.
very
Agradezco el honor
pleased to be here.
de la
I
invitación,
appreciate the honor
agradezco
of
la
the
presencia de
invitation.
tantas
I
personalidades, pero
appreciate the
sobre todo
presence
quiero
of so many
agradecer a la doctora Isabel
personalities, but
Rosillo de la
above
Universidad
all,
Autónoma
I
de
want to
Querétaro,
thank
su
Doctora
impulso, y ella
Isarelli
es parte,
Rosillo from the
es parte de los
Autonomous
culpables de que
University
estemos
of
el
Queretaro.
día
Her
de hoy aquí.
encouragement
Quiero
and
saludar
decisions
a
to
todos
be
los
part
jóvenes que se
of this
encuentran
event
presentes.
today. I want to
Este
greet
es
all
un
the young
pensamiento, esto es
people
una
who are
reflexión para
present.
ustedes
This
jóvenes.
is a
Ustedes son el
reflection.
motor
You
del
are
cambio.
the engine of
Quiero hablar un
change. I
poquito
will
sobre la
talk a
seguridad
little about
alimentaria y
food
el cambio
security
climático. ¿A
and
qué nos va a
climate
llevar
change.
este
What this
aumento de
temperature
temperatura
increase will
con
take
respecto a la
us in
disponibilidad de
relation to the
alimentos?
availability
Sabemos
of
que la
food.
seguridad
We know
alimentaria
that
está
food
relacionada
security
con el
is
acceso
related
físico,
to the
social y
physical,
económico de los
social,
alimentos
and
para
economic
todos y
access
para
of
todas.
food
Necesitamos
for
alimentos
all. We
seguros,
need safe,
suficientes,
sufficient, and
nutritivos, que
nutritious food
satisfagan las
that
necesidades
meets
de
the
cada
needs
uno
of
y de
each
cada
one
una
of us.
de
The
nosotros.
right not to
El
suffer from
derecho a no
hunger
padecer
also
hambre
means the right
significa
to
también el
have a
derecho
full
de tener una
life.
vida
To
plena.
achieve the UN
Para alcanzar
Sustainable
los
Development Goals
objetivos
by 2030, it implies that
para el
we
desarrollo
have to make a
sostenible
great
de la
effort,
ONU para el
particularly in
2030
food security.
implica que
Climate
tenemos que
change
hacer un
is
gran esfuerzo,
significantly affecting
particularmente en
food
seguridad
availability. It
alimentaria.
is
El
not
cambio climático
about
está
supplying
afectando de
one
forma
food
importante
for
la
another. We
disponibilidad
have
de
lost the
alimentos.
culture, the
No
ancestral
se trata de
gastronomy, where
suplir
traditional
unos
foods
alimentos
had
por otros.
important
Hemos
characteristics
perdido
at the
la
nutritional
cultura,
level,
la
and we have
gastronomía
changed them for
ancestral,
processed
en donde
foods
nuestros
that
alimentos
unfortunately are
tradicionales
related
pues
to
tenían características importantes a nivel de
prevalence
la
of
nutrición
important
y los hemos
diseases
cambiado por
such as
alimentos
diabetes and
procesados
learning
que
problems. But we
lamentablemente
also
están
know that hunger is
relacionados
related
con
to
la
serious
prevalencia de
social
enfermedades
problems,
importantes
violence,
como
disparity,
diabetes,
inequality. You
como
also know
problemas
that
para el
anxiety and
aprendizaje.
stress
Pero
affect
también
us in an
sabemos
important way,
que
and
el
it is
hambre
mainly
está
related to
relacionada
hunger. In
con
our
problemas
country, there
sociales
are more than
gravísimos,
50
con
million people
violencia,
in poverty,
con
people who do not
disparidad,
have
con
food day
inequidad.
by day, and
Sabemos
that takes
también
them
que la
precisely to
ansiedad,
join
el
the ranks
estrés
of organized
nos
crime.
afecta de
Food
forma
insecurity
importante
is
y está
undoubtedly
relacionado
related to
principalmente con el hecho
hydroclimatic
del
phenomena,
hambre.
more
En
constant
nuestro país,
extreme
ya
natural
decía el
disasters,
canciller, hay
speed
más de
in
50
seasonal
millones
changes
de
that
personas
generate
en pobreza,
uncertainty
de personas
about
que no
the
cuentan con
sufficiency
alimentos
of
día con día
resources,
y que
about
eso
the
los lleva
quality of the
justamente
soil,
a sumarse
about
a las
the
filas del crimen
possibility of having
organizado.
crops
La
in
inseguridad
time to
alimentaria,
be
desde
able
luego,
to cover
está
not
relacionada con los
only the
fenómenos
family need,
hidroclimáticos.
but the
Desastres
economic need
naturales
that
extremos
also
más
allows
constantes
growth
celeridad
and
en los cambios de
development.
temporada
This
que generan
vulnerability
incertidumbre
makes
sobre la
us think
suficiencia de los
of
recursos,
different
sobre la calidad del
situations,
suelo,
among them
sobre la
the loss
posibilidad de
of
contar con
biodiversity
cosechas a
and soil
tiempo para poder cubrir no
soil
solamente
degradation.
la
We
necesidad
also see
familiar,
the
sino la
danger.
necesidad
We
económica que
also
permita
see the
el
danger
crecimiento y el
of the
desarrollo.
loss of use
Esta
and
vulnerabilidad
customs
nos
of
hace
the
pensar en
populations.
diferentes
We
situaciones,
have to think
entre
about the
ellas la pérdida
practices
de la
that we are
biodiversidad,
carrying
la
out.
degradación del
It
suelo.
is not possible
Vemos
that
también en
livestock farming
peligro el uso y
produces
costumbres
more
de las
greenhouse
poblaciones.
gases than
Tenemos que
industry
pensar en
or
las prácticas que
automobiles.
estamos llevando a cabo.
9%
No es
of all
posible
the
que la
carbon
ganadería
dioxide
produzca
produced in the
más gases
world
de
is
efecto
related to
invernadero
livestock.
que la industria o
We
que los
need to
automóviles.
find
El
sustainable
9% de
production
todo el
methods.
dióxido de
We
carbono
also
que
need
se
to
produce
find
en el mundo
circular
está
economy
relacionado con la
strategies.
ganadería.
The
Necesitamos
fact
encontrar
that
métodos
climate
de
change
producción
affects food,
sostenible y
that climate
sustentable.
change affects
Necesitamos
world
encontrar
food is
también
undeniable.
estrategias de
It is
economía
very
circular.
important that
Es
governments
innegable el
take
hecho
the
de que el cambio
responsibility to
climático
generate
afecta la
technology
alimentación mundial.
and knowledge.
Es
Today,
importantísimo que los
education,
gobiernos se
empathy,
responsabilicen
dialogue,
de la parte que les
responsible
toca,
consumption,
generando las estrategias
sustainable
para la
production,
transferencia de
circular
tecnología
economy,
y de
and
conocimiento.
ethical
Hoy, la
determination
educación,
for a
la
life
empatía,
in
el
community
diálogo,
are
el consumo
essential to
responsable,
achieve
la
the
producción
objectives of the
sustentable, la economía
2030
circular
agenda.
y la
It is
determinación
essential
ética
that
por
we
una vida
adopt
en comunidad
adaptation
son
measures and
fundamentales para
mitigation
lograr los
against climate
objetivos
change
de la
to
Agenda del
achieve Goal
2030.
2,
Es
zero
indispensable que
hunger. No
adoptemos
one
medidas
hungry
de
today,
adaptación
no
y
one
mitigación
hungry tomorrow.
contra el cambio climático para
This
lograr
effort
llegar
must be
a cumplir el
comprehensive
objetivo
and
número 2,
transversal,
cero hambre.
including
Nadie con hambre
not
hoy,
only environmental
nadie
issues,
con
but
hambre
also
mañana.
gender,
Este esfuerzo debe ser un
participation,
esfuerzo integral y
inclusion, and
transversal
care
que
for vulnerable
incluya
groups.
no solamente
And my
temas de
message
ambiente, sino de
is
género,
for
de
young people.
participación, de
My message
inclusión,
is to
de
tell them
atención a
that our
grupos
generation
vulnerables.
is
Y mi
indebted to
mensaje
you
es para los
for
jóvenes.
having
Mi
allowed
mensaje es
so much
decirles
time
que
to
nuestra
pass
generación está
without
en deuda
concrete
con
actions.
ustedes por haber
Let's
dejado
work
pasar tanto
together.
tiempo sin
Let's
acciones
work
concretas.
hand in hand.
Trabajemos juntos,
Knowing young
trabajemos de la
people
mano. Pero el saber,
that
jóvenes,
you are
que ustedes
here
están aquí,
working to achieve
que
these
están
objectives
trabajando por lograr estos
fill us
objetivos,
with hope.
nos llena de
Thank you
esperanza.
very
Muchísimas
much.
gracias.
I wish I could be with you in Mexico at this critically important meeting. I'm kept away by coronavirus. The outbreak has come to Britain, and it would be far too risky for me to come out to Mexico. What I would like to do first of all is pay my respects to my good friend Pachauri. I have known Pachi since about 2003, and I've always admired his real commitment to action on climate change, whether he was working at Terry as the director or as chairman of the IPCC. He has done so much in developing the understanding around the world of the threats posed by climate change. And his personal commitment to action and his passion have been an example to many. We miss him. I would like to make a few comments on the current state of climate change in the world today. Since the major achievement of the Paris COP, that meeting in Paris in 2015, unfortunately, progress around the world has not matched up to the enthusiasm expressed once the agreement had been reached. Emissions are now rising faster than ever before, and I think what is particularly important is that emissions of carbon dioxide are now being matched by rising emissions of methane. And what this means is that when we talk of the remaining carbon budget, we're very quickly out of date, even if we talk about that 1.5 degrees centigrade target. We're quickly out of date because of the rate of rise. If we look at the 1.5 IPCC report 2019, there was a kind of assumption there that we were plateauing out in terms of our emissions of greenhouse gases, and this has not happened. But more than that, I now want to say that 1.5 degrees centigrade, which is a target I fought for in Paris, is really not good enough. In other words, the challenge produced around the world with a global temperature now 1.1, 1.2 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial level is very severe. The melting of the polar ice cap, particularly in the Arctic region, means that the Arctic Circle region is now heating up at 2.5 times the rate of the rest of the planet. And of course that's worrying because Greenland sits there adjacent to the Arctic Sea, and as we move forward in time, we can be sure, unless we manage the problem, that Greenland ice will be lost with a 7-meter sea level rise. This may take time, but we're looking at 1 or 2 meters sea level rise by the end of the century. So what we now look at is the need for a new alignment of governments around the world to manage to understand that we can no longer simply manage all these problems by reducing our emissions to net zero, for example. We have to go beyond that. And I'm calling on governments around the world to unite under a banner of climate repair. And by climate repair, I mean 3 things. 1, reducing our emissions rapidly and quickly so that we can at least begin to manage the rest of the problem. But secondly, we need to learn to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere at scale. And by at scale, I mean we need to bring greenhouse gases down from the current level, which is 415 parts per million of carbon dioxide, add in methane, and we're approaching 500, 510 parts per million. We need to bring that down to 350 parts per million or less to create a safer world. And thirdly, we need to look at the melting ice caps, the polar caps, both in the Antarctic and the Arctic region, but also the ice caps on, for example, the Himalayas, and see whether we can, in the meantime, learn to refreeze these. These 3 actions are what is now needed from governments around the world as we move to COP26 in Glasgow in November this year. Thank you very much.
Dear Dr. Pachauri, today, as your old friend, we would like to talk to you with our highest respect. And also to the audience, we would like to express our condolences with great sorrow. We will not forget the global Let a Billion People initiative you conceived and launched to promote the export of clean energy to the poor. We will not forget your call for people around the world to come together to face climate change. We will not forget your visit to China Biodiversity Conservation and Green Development Foundation to discuss the importance of youth to the planet. Every time we meet, we not only learn a great deal from you, but also get encouraged and for the world future. In your contribution to the cause of global environmental protection, especially climate change related issues, is a man worldwide and encourage us to move forward. And in these sad days, we hope we can get together to remember you and to carry on your spirit, to faithful your task, your works together. And deeply in our hearts, we need your guidance and hope we can do as much as you expect to save the world from climate change. China Biodiversity Conservation and Green Development is a true follower of you, and we will continue to do our best in all those areas, including reducing, recycling, reuse area, including low carbon, decarbon, and including the promote of use in these activities. Hopefully, with your guidance in China, we can do better for the sustainable development goals and to make the world a sustainable one.
Good morning to the distinguished guests, fellow speakers, and participants of the World Sustainable Development Forum. I am very excited to be in Durango City for the first time and to discuss the most important matter of climate change. Thank you to the POP movement and the WSDF for including youth in each aspect of this forum. As I am from Barbados in the Caribbean, it is only fair that I discuss the impacts of climate change on small island developing states. So firstly, there are 58 SIDS countries in 3 regions in the world, and some of them have multiple islands of various sizes. The regions are the Caribbean, Pacific, and the Atlantic, Indian Ocean, and South China Sea. With respect to climate change, SIDS contribute less than 1% of global greenhouse gases, but are one of the most vulnerable to the impacts. We already have our own vulnerabilities like limited resources like land, water, fuel, and food, some of which we have to import. We have small economies. Some of us have islands that are volcanic and are subject to tectonic activity, and of course in the path of tropical storms and hurricanes. Climate change is and will only make us more vulnerable. So we already know that climate change is it's caused by human activities, and the impacts will and is affecting and will increasingly threaten livelihoods, coastal and inland settlements, infrastructure, ecosystems, and biodiversity and economic stability of SIDS. Impacts on resources in one place will affect other places that rely on those resources and cause a chain reaction because we are very interdependent on each other in the world. We are already 1 degree Celsius warmer and are likely to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2030. And a 2 degrees Celsius warming will only have more adverse impacts than a 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. So limiting it to 1.5 is very essential. So the major impacts for us are sea level rise, increased surface temperature and sea surface temperature, increased frequency and intensity of strong weather systems, and a change in precipitation. So in terms of temperature, every year seems to break another hottest year record. The average increase has been about 0.85 degrees Celsius. And as I said before, it's already at 1 degree Celsius. In the tropics, we can expect more hot days and nights and more and longer unbearable heat waves. With respect to rainfall, it varies per region and even within regions. For example, in the Caribbean, there's a decrease in rainfall overall, but in the Northern Caribbean, it is less than in the Southern Caribbean. And we know how important fresh water is for everyone. In terms of sea level rise, It is caused by melting ice caps and glaciers and expanding seawater. It has been more than average in the last decade by 1.3 to 1.7 millimeters per year. And of course, again, each region has different situations. Like the sea level rise will be higher in the Pacific region than in the Caribbean. Some islands in the Pacific are already disappearing. Although some of them were uninhabitable, it can still happen to those that have people on it. And my friends from the Pacific, they complain about the king tides. And I'm very inspired by their action of actually working together as young people and putting barriers to protect their villages from the sea level. Again, different interactions play a role in sea level rise, like changing surface winds, changing currents from melting ice, and the El Nino Southern Oscillation. In terms of more intense weather, in the Caribbean and in all the different SIDS, we have hurricanes and storms that affect us. And it seems to be the new normal from warmer sea temperatures. In the Atlantic, there have been 36 Category 5 storms since 1924, and they seem to be becoming more frequent and more intense. Before, they would come every couple of years, but since 2016, there was at least one every year. So we are always anxious in the Caribbean every hurricane season and do our preparations and hope not to get hit by these hurricanes. I personally have never been on an island during a hurricane, and I really don't want to. Last year, we all watched as Hurricane Dorian, as Category 5 hurricane, decimated some islands of the Bahamas. And as we are on islands, we do not have anywhere else to go. We will have to move to a continent like the US or South America in order to get away from these hurricanes. So we're hoping that we don't have many environmental refugees from climate change. On islands, many people live in the low-lying coastal areas. Some islands like atolls in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean are completely coastal. So sea level rise can definitely impact these islands by destroying infrastructure. On my island, for example, the island's main power plant is located basically on the beach. And if there is extensive sea level rise, we will not have power to our entire island. In terms of marine ecosystems, they are important for islands and the economy. And sea level rise like hurricanes and increased temperatures would affect the mangroves and coral reefs, which are needed for our coastal protection. Coastal and marine, coral reefs are already being bleached, and we really depend on it for our tourism, which is a main industry in the region. Exceeding 2 degrees Celsius will definitely drive the loss of 99% of reef building corals. And future impacts of climate-related drivers will exacerbate the impacts of non-climate related drivers. Sorry about that. In terms of terrestrial ecosystems, you can have species shifts, a decline in the range and invasion of exotic and pest species, which have all already been observed. And islands have high levels of endemism and biodiversity, so this will definitely really impact us compared to continental areas. In terms of public health, you can have increased vector-borne diseases like dengue, increased heat stress, and this is on people, plants, and animals, increased risk of food and waterborne diseases, and of course, death. In terms of solutions, I think that we need to raise more awareness about climate change impacts, especially with the youth, because, of course, the youth are our future. You have resource restoration initiatives like artificial beach nourishment, coral and mangrove restoration, and also rainwater harvesting, replanting trees, and of course, international cooperation. We need everyone on board to really work together to help SIDS to survive from climate change impacts. And that's it.
Thank you. Ahora vamos a dejar la palabra a Chloé Moinjon, que viene de la Escuela Superior de Comercio de París, Business School en París.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really pleased to be here with you today. I come from France, and I always love my country because on the side of the world where I come from, we have 4 different seasons. Each one is unique and as fascinating as the other. I've often been asked which one I prefer, but I've never been able to choose. And I hope that one day my children will say the same. And not because they will no longer be able to distinguish the seasons, but because they really love the singularity of each of them as much as I do. For that, we need to find a solution because obviously nowadays we have a problem called global warming. In order to conserve our planet, we have a challenge to face, which is not exceeded an increase of 1.5 degrees by 2100, compared to pre-industrial times. Moreover, as already being said, exceeding 2 degrees would have not only harmful, but also irreversible consequences on our ecosystem and on human beings. In addition, 10 million more people are likely to be exposed to climate risk related to sea level rise, and coral reefs are expected to decline by another 70 to 90%. Now that we are no longer ignored the fact that we have a very serious problem, we must all mobilize to find solutions. We must do it now, and we must do it together. In my opinion, this is a real fight. A fight against ourselves, first of all. We must all be convinced of the reality of the danger and change our way of thinking, but also our way of behaving, which is not always easy. By changing our habits and routines and making choices that have less harmful effect on the environment, we have the power to confront the climate change. It is a fight against pollution, plastic waste, overconsumption, carbon emission. But if we look further, it is also a fight to change the system, to improve it, to focus less on profits and more on developing a more balanced and equitable future for an economic, social, and an environmental point of view. For this, we must all work together. We must involve public and private non-state actors, institutional investors, the banking system, civil society, and scientific institutions. History shows us that collective mobilization can be a source of change. We must all mobilize, all generations, young and old, men and women. In fact, women around the world are disproportionately affected by the effect of climate change. Women are the first victim of global warming, who will suffer the most if the temperature rises above 1.5 degrees. As a reminder, 60 to 80% of food in developing countries is produced by women. The scarcity of natural resources affects the working time of women who are responsible to bringing water, for example. Therefore, older women have less time to engage in paying activities, and younger women are put to work to the detriment of their scholarship. Women are still underrepresented in the fight against climate change, yet their initiatives are numerous, particularly in water, energy, and reforestation sector. To stay below the 1.5 degrees, therefore, gender equality and women's empowerment must be promoted. I still have hope. I believe that we can build a better world. Stay below the 1.5 degrees. And I believe that human beings are not stupid enough to destroy completely their only habitat, the Earth. We have in the world all the specialists we need to find solutions and enough money to act if we really want it. The only thing we need is to convince everyone and get the change going. That's why, in my opinion, your demonstration and this type of meeting like today are so important. The more people act, the bigger is the impact. So let's act now for us, for our children, and for the planet. Thank you.
I want to say that we have first seen the presentations of the experts and that they showed us, even with the maps, what it means to raise the temperature of the planet by 1.5 degrees centigrade. An escalation to 2 degrees or 3 degrees, which is absolutely unsustainable. We have also listened to academics from both UNAM and the Autonomous University of Queretaro talk about food security and the role of science. And we have heard young women, one from the Caribbean and the other from France, tell us about the role of youth. I think we have enough elements and the ability to decide which world we want to live in. 2 days ago, we had the opportunity in Quito, together with the former president of Spain, Felipe González, to launch an initiative to make a revolution of small things. Sometimes we are waiting for the big decisions of governments. We are waiting to see what others do, and also the local governments that play a very important role. President Lagos spoke of large companies that often have a larger budget than the largest countries, but also have much higher carbon emission rates. But what we can do, what can young people do who have perhaps the greatest burden of responsibility than the governments, but also what can I do from my space? Like those little things, those purchasing decisions, whether or not to use an element, because we don't know where it comes from, what its load is, and its impact on the footprint it leaves on the planet. That is in our hands. So, I propose the revolution of small things. We thank the participants, both the keynote speakers and the members of the panel, for their presence. Thank you.